Greetings, viewers, and welcome back to our channel. A multitude of significant events have unfolded across the globe, impacting international relations, economics, and politics. We'll be delving into these developments today, providing analysis and context. Stick around until the conclusion, as we'll be summarizing the key takeaways and offering our final thoughts on what these events signify for the future. The world stage is constantly shifting, and understanding these dynamics is crucial. Before we proceed, if you find value in our content and appreciate staying informed on crucial global matters, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell ensures you won't miss any updates. Also, giving this video a thumbs up really helps us reach a wider audience. Your support is incredibly important for the channel's growth. We encourage you to engage in the comments section below. Let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see our global viewership. Your participation makes this community vibrant. All right, let's get into the latest major development. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a significant update regarding the ongoing tariff situation. Just breaking. Reports indicate that over 50 countries have formally reached out to President Trump's team to initiate negotiations for new trade agreements. This information comes directly from the U.S. National Economic Council director, adding substantial weight to the news. This development wasn't entirely unexpected, at least not to those closely monitoring the administration's trade policies and the global economic landscape. We anticipated a move like this, knowing the inherent leverage the United States holds. You might recall the discourse from various commentators, particularly those leaning liberal, who suggested these nations would simply pivot and strike deals with China. They questioned, why wouldn't these 50-plus countries bypass the U.S. and strengthen ties with the Chinese instead? That was precisely my question too, posed rhetorically, of course. The answer lies in a fundamental economic reality. You simply cannot replace the United States consumer base. The sheer scale and purchasing power of American consumers represent a market that no other single nation, including China, can fully substitute. This economic gravity is a cornerstone of American influence in global trade negotiations. The data supports this. Look at the market capitalization rankings. The United States consistently tops the list, dwarfing others with figures like $51.868 trillion in market cap, represented by nearly 3,700 companies. China follows at $7.402 trillion, with 323 companies. Japan at $4.794 trillion, and so on down the list. The sheer volume of goods and services we purchase from other nations, reflected in our substantial trade deficits with many of these very countries, underscores this point. It is, frankly, an insane level of economic activity and consumption. So, the idea that these 50 nations would simply walk away and find equivalent opportunities elsewhere ignores this fundamental imbalance. They are coming to the table because they understand the significance of access to the American market. This outreach isn't happening in a vacuum. It's a direct consequence of the pressure exerted through tariff policies and the undeniable reality of America's economic indispensability. The numbers, the market realities, they all point to why these negotiations are happening now. We strongly encourage you to watch this video through to the end. We'll be diving deeper into the implications of these negotiations, the specific strategies at play, and offering comprehensive conclusions on what this means for the global economy and the United States' position within it. Don't miss out on the full analysis. Now, let's dissect why this leverage exists and why the alternative often suggested, simply trading more with China, isn't a viable solution for most countries reliant on the U.S. market. The United States consumer base isn't just large, it's diverse, and has an appetite for a vast range of goods, from high-tech electronics to agricultural products to manufactured items. This demand fuels economies around the world. Consider the sheer number of companies operating within the U.S., as indicated by the market cap data. Nearly 3,700 significant entities compared to China's 323 or Japan's 643. This vast internal market creates intricate supply chains and dependencies that cannot be easily replicated. The argument often floated by critics was, why aren't they all just flocking to the Chinese to establish trade deals? My counter question remains, Can they truly afford not to deal with the U.S.? The reality is, for many of these 50-plus nations, the U.S. market represents a critical, often primary, export destination. Replacing that volume and value is an immense, likely impossible challenge. China, while a massive economy, has a different consumption pattern and internal market structure. Furthermore, the existing trade relationships, logistical networks, and established business connections with the U.S. are deeply entrenched. Severing or significantly diminishing these ties in favor of an unproven, large-scale pivot to China involves enormous risk and uncertainty. The trade deficit itself tells a story. The fact that the U.S. consistently runs deficits with numerous countries signifies that we buy significantly more from them than they buy from us. This buying power translates directly into negotiating leverage. When the biggest customer in the room proposes new terms, suppliers listen. It's not about political alignment necessarily, it's about economic necessity. The power isn't just in the size, but also in the established patterns of consumption and the integral role the U.S. plays in global financial systems. Attempting to bypass this linchpin of the global economy isn't a simple matter of choice for these nations. It involves potentially crippling disruptions to their own economic stability. Therefore, the outreach to President Trump's team isn't merely a political maneuver. It's a pragmatic response rooted in the unavoidable economic realities of global trade, where the American consumer remains king. The impactfulness, the sheer powerfulness of the U.S. economy dictates these interactions. Let's explore the strategic thinking behind the tariff policies and address some common criticisms, such as the seemingly odd targeting of small entities or locations. The idea of tariffing an island populated mainly by penguins, a point sometimes used to ridicule the Trump administration's approach, actually highlights a crucial aspect of comprehensive trade enforcement. While it sounds absurd on the surface, the underlying principle is about closing potential loopholes. Countries seeking to circumvent tariffs on their primary goods might attempt to funnel trade through smaller, less scrutinized territories, or use shell corporations registered in seemingly insignificant locations, even theoretically, an island of penguins. If you don't apply tariffs broadly, including these potential conduits, you create avenues for manipulation. The goal isn't to tax penguins, it's to prevent larger economic players from using such territories as safe havens to dodge levies imposed on their main exports. It's about ensuring the integrity of the tariff structure. You must subvert the idea that countries can simply reroute their goods through untariffed locations. This comprehensive approach, while sometimes appearing overly broad, is designed to make circumvention difficult and costly, thereby forcing countries to engage directly in negotiations rather than seeking workarounds. This is also linked to the concept of reciprocal tariffs. It's been pointed out correctly that the Trump administration's focus wasn't solely on the tariffs imposed by other countries, but often on the overall trade deficit. However, it's also crucial to acknowledge practices like the value-added tax, VAT, common in many European nations. While not labeled as a traditional tariff, VATs function similarly by taxing foreign imports, making U.S. goods less competitive in those European markets. These are non-tariff barriers that create an uneven playing field. So, when the administration talked about reciprocity, it wasn't just about matching tariff percentages. It was about addressing the entire structure of trade, including these embedded taxes and regulations that disadvantage U.S. exports. The administration's stance, as articulated, was that if other countries employed mechanisms making it harder for U.S. goods, the U.S. was justified in using its own tools, like tariffs, to level the field, or more accurately, to exert pressure for renegotiation. The goal was a reset, moving away from agreements perceived as unfair or unbalanced, where the U.S. absorbed global surpluses without equivalent market access for its own products. The current situation, with 50 nations seeking talks, suggests this pressure campaign is yielding the intended results, forcing a reconsideration of existing trade dynamics. Looking ahead, what does this influx of negotiation requests mean? It signifies a potential large-scale restructuring of global trade agreements involving the United States. My prediction, and admittedly predicting Trump's moves on tariffs can be tricky as his unpredictability is part of the strategy, is that we are likely to see significant renegotiated deals emerge over the next 4 or 5 months. We're already seeing the pieces fall into place. Consider the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. While largely established, there's ongoing discussion, particularly concerning Canada, pending their political cycles like the Canadian election outcome, which could influence further adjustments. Beyond North America, we've already witnessed successful renegotiations or solidified agreements with key partners. Vietnam, a major manufacturing hub, has engaged. Israel, a strategic ally, is on board. India, a rapidly growing economic power, has been part of these discussions. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit, has also sought new terms. These aren't minor players. They represent significant global economic forces, acknowledging the need to adapt to the new American stance. Now, the European Union appears poised to counter with its own reciprocal tariffs, potentially escalating the situation. However, the underlying dynamic revealed by the White House economic advisor remains. Countries understand they bear a significant portion of the tariff burden due to inelastic supply chains. They can't simply stop selling to the U.S. overnight without severe consequences. They've been, in his words, dumping goods to create jobs domestically, relying on the U.S. to absorb this output. This long-run trade deficit is evidence of this pattern. The fact that over 50 countries, according to the USTR report cited by the advisor, have reached out underscores their understanding that the old arrangements are no longer tenable under this administration's approach. They are seeking new deals because the pressure is mounting, and the alternative of being shut out or facing high tariffs on the lucrative U.S. market is too damaging to ignore. This wave of negotiations points towards a significant shift, potentially leading to trade frameworks that are, from the U.S. perspective, more balanced and beneficial to domestic interests. The widespread outreach from over 50 nations wanting to negotiate new trade deals with the Trump administration is a testament to the economic leverage the United States wields. As the National Economic Council director highlighted, these countries recognize that they ultimately absorb much of the impact from tariffs due to their reliance on the U.S. market and relatively inelastic supply capabilities. They cannot simply redirect their exports elsewhere without significant economic disruption. The persistent U.S. trade deficit has long been a sign of this imbalance, where the U.S. consumes vast amounts of foreign goods. The current administration, under President Trump, has explicitly challenged this status quo, using tariffs not just as a revenue source, but as a powerful tool to force a reset of global trade relationships. This strategy is predicated on the understanding that the U.S. consumer base is largely irreplaceable for most exporting nations. While critics initially suggested countries would pivot to China, the reality unfolding is different. Nations are lining up to talk, seeking to secure continued access to the world's largest economy. This isn't just about avoiding tariffs. It's about acknowledging the fundamental economic gravity of the United States. The agreements already reached or in progress with nations like Vietnam, India, the UK, and the ongoing dynamics with USMCA partners signal a broader trend. Even potential countermeasures, like the EU's threatened reciprocal tariffs, highlight the tension created by this assertive American posture. The short-term economic turbulence, like the dip in the stock market, is viewed by the administration and its supporters as a necessary trade-off for achieving long-term goals: fairer trade deals, revitalized domestic production, and a more self-sufficient American economy. Young people, often less invested in the stock market and more concerned with tangible costs like housing, may even be less perturbed by these short-term market fluctuations if the long-term outcome is perceived as beneficial. The strategy, therefore, involves leveraging America's unique position. It's about moving away from decades of trade policies that facilitated massive imports and led to significant deficits towards a framework where reciprocity is demanded. This involves addressing not just direct tariffs, but also indirect barriers, like VATs used by other nations. Trump's approach, characterized by its boldness and unpredictability, aims to keep negotiating partners off balance, making them more amenable to concessions. Reports suggesting he's relying on a smaller circle of advisors could indicate a more focused, perhaps more hardline approach in this second phase or potential second term. He appears determined to reshape these deals, even if it means enduring initial economic headwinds. The goal isn't necessarily isolationism, but rather achieving trade terms that prioritize American economic interests and national security, reducing reliance on potentially adversarial nations for critical goods. This involves complex diplomacy, using economic strength as the primary lever. The fact that so many countries are engaging suggests that, despite the controversy surrounding the methods, the underlying pressure is proving effective in forcing a global trade dialogue centered on American terms. The reliance of these nations on the daddy, the United States consumer, means they ultimately need to negotiate. Ultimately, the situation underscores the immense, almost unparalleled economic authority the United States possesses. Decades of acting as the world's primary consumer engine created dependencies that are now being leveraged. While previous administrations might have hesitated to disrupt the status quo due to potential short-term economic pain, like stock market dips, the Trump approach embraces this disruption as necessary for a long-term correction. The fear-mongering about catastrophic economic consequences, such as the $4,000 cost per family figures often cited, fails to account for the complexity of these negotiations and the potential long-term benefits of rebalanced trade and increased domestic production. Calculating the exact cost is virtually impossible because the final outcomes of these 50-plus negotiations are unknown. Will tariffs remain on all countries? Likely not. Deals will be struck, concessions made, and new frameworks established. Canada and Mexico will almost certainly have renegotiated terms within the USMCA context. Argentina might achieve zero tariffs. Vietnam's existing arrangement could be formalized or altered. Each negotiation will be unique, strategically assessed based on U.S. interests. Can the goods be produced domestically? Is the trading partner a strategic ally? Does the current arrangement unfairly disadvantage U.S. producers through tariffs or other barriers like VAT or differing labor laws? The revenue generated from tariffs that do remain could potentially fund domestic initiatives, like the proposed tax cuts on tips or overtime, further shifting the economic landscape. This isn't just about trade. It's about using economic policy to achieve broader domestic goals, including strengthening the U.S. manufacturing base and improving job quality, moving away from an economy perceived by some to be overly reliant on low-quality or part-time service jobs, driven by the need to combat inflation. Trump knows the U.S. holds the cards due to its wealth and consumer power. He's forcing a situation where countries must either negotiate terms more favorable to the U.S. or risk losing significant access to their most crucial market. It's a high-stakes economic reset, and these 50 countries coming to the table are the first major sign of its impact.